Today, Trump made good on a campaign promise fulfilling a longtime Republican priority, signing an executive order to dismantle the Federal Department of Education, which is already one of the smallest cabinet-level departments. Trump can't just unilaterally close it. That would require an act of Congress. But there are things the administration could do to stop the department from functioning. Residents, educators, teachers from across the country aren't taking the move lying down.
They're hurting kids. And that's just untenable. We can't be hurting our kids.
Basic education is enriches our communities, and it's hard to imagine a world without that.
I think what we do today has national implications, and I hope that we come out and show a strong message that education matters, that teachers' voices matter, and that we are going to show up and stand up for kids.
Joining me now is Randi Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, and Kevin Vick, president of the Colorado Education Association. Randi, you and I have been at a lot of tables talking education over many years, and we have not always seen eye to eye. And I will confess, back in my early days, I was very much in the early 80s, like, yeah, you know, they just created this department. What do we need it for? But we are now 40 years into this relationship between our states and the federal government in this partnership. I'd just like you to take a moment to let folks know what this means, because there are two essential players here that I learned as lieutenant governor in looking at education in Maryland that are above all else: the teacher and the student. That's the relationship. It's not the administrators and the bureaucracy and all. At the end of the day, this boils down to how a teacher teaches and a student learns. If you could take a moment and just share some thoughts around what this moment means when you're thinking about teachers and students.
So first off, Michael, thank you. There's the practical, and then there's the symbolic. And I was thinking about that as I was waiting to get on, that you and I had lots of disagreements and disagreed about some things in terms of education and some ways of improving education. But the abandonment, and this is the first point I would make, of a new president, first time I think in the Republic, basically saying we are abandoning the federal role in education. That is what's so chilling here. The pragmatic and the practical are really important too, because this is basically $1 out of every 9 is going to be taken from local schools, from a school district that is saying this is for a child, your summer school program, your after school program, the computers we buy, the welding equipment we buy for career tech ed, the OT or the PT, occupational therapist or speech therapist or physical therapist that a child with disabilities may get. This money, $100 billion, it's real money that goes directly to kids and that supports what teachers and paraprofessionals do in classrooms for kids. That's part of the reason why virtually every teacher, as Kevin will tell you, every teacher knows about this. But the symbolic one is what unites America, which is that a new president, first time Republican or Democratic in the modern age, since World War II, since the GI Bill was passed, saying, I am abandoning, I am pulling back the federal role. And so it's not just the education department here, it's also the assault on libraries. It's also the assault on universities. It's also basically taking away what universities do in terms of research to find the cure of cancer. It is an assault on knowledge. It is an assault on what our kids need: curiosity, innovation, confidence in the future. That's what's so stunning about this. And the last thing I'll say is schools are controlled, as you know, as Lieutenant Governor, schools are controlled by state education committees and by local school boards. So this has nothing to do with that. This has to do with taking away the opportunity that the federal role has provided to lift kids who were left behind.
Kevin, you have been on the front line today with teachers and students and concerned citizens there in Colorado and organizing. I wouldn't even say so much a protest, but a reminder of the importance of education. I want you to listen to some students who were here at the Department of Education today in Washington and what they had to say.
I'm here today with students outside the Department of Education because Trump and his billionaire friends are trying to take away our public schools so that they can continue to line their own profits. I'm terrified. And I think it just goes to show that Trump is serious about hurting working people and young people for his own power and profit.
Kevin, talk about that aspect of what this young lady referenced, and that is the pain that will come from these, from what's happening now with the department, and how that plays out for students K through 12 in colleges and universities around the country who are, right in that sweet spot in that relationship between the federal government, right, which is sort of the safety net support, providing programs that really help the poorest in communities, help those who are educationally disadvantaged to find a leg and support what the system, as Ms. Weingarten noted, that is being controlled by the states.
Well, first of all, I appreciate you having me on tonight. It's a big honor. And I think the young lady said it really well, that there is just such a level of uncertainty right now, such a level of anxiety, and really such a level of stress that is playing out across education, the entire education landscape. And so what our particular situation was today was, on top of the federal uncertainty, our state budget situation is such that we're looking at potential cuts in education again after, on top of another 15 years of cuts that we have been suffering under here in Colorado. And so I think what we saw today was people deciding that they needed to take action, they needed their voices heard, and we had a huge turnout today. I would estimate around 10,000 educators, students, community members, all coming together to say what's happening is not right, and we have to find a better way.
Today, in the wake of the Trump administration invoking a 1798 law to ship hundreds of Venezuelan migrants out of the country in apparent defiance of a court order, the federal judge overseeing that case responded to what the Trump Department of Justice submitted, writing, quote, "The government again evaded its obligations," and that its response was woefully insufficient. The judge ordered the government to file a brief by Tuesday showing cause on why they violated the order and failed to turn the planes headed to the Supermax prison in El Salvador around. Lee Gallant is the lead counsel on this case, deputy director of the ACLU's Immigrant Rights Project, and he joins me now. Lee, it really seems like the government right now is sort of disobeying the court while pretending not to, or doing like the least possible. Like, how do you understand where we are with this case?
Yeah. So I think there are two parts to it, as you know. One is, did the government violate the court's order by not turning the planes around and bringing the individuals back after he had ordered a stop to the policy, a temporary stop? The other part of it, of course, is what the president's doing with this wartime authority lawful? And so what you're referring to is the part about defying his orders. We think the facts are pretty clear, but we are not going to get ahead of the judge. We're going to allow the judge to find these facts and ultimately decide whether his own order was violated. And if he finds that the order was violated, we are going to certainly ask him to get these individuals back. Normally a federal judge can't order another country to do something or release people in their prisons. I think it's pretty clear, though, that the U.S. is running the show here, and they're constructively in U.S. custody, and El Salvador is essentially functioning like a private prison. So we will see what the judge does with whether the facts and, whether they violated the order, and then ask him for various forms of relief, but most prominently ask him to bring the individuals back. On the other question, the main question in the case, was the use of this 1798 law lawful? Absolutely not. Congress could not have been clearer. You can use it when there's a foreign government or nation in a declared war with the United States, or a foreign government or nation is invading our country or making predatory incursions. The law could not be clear. And so, and you and I have talked about this a lot, Chris, that this is fundamentally a separation of powers question. The president is just thumbing his nose on the limitations Congress put in the law. And those limitations have been clear for the entire 200 plus years the law has been in existence. The law has only been invoked 3 times in our country's history, all during declared wars: the War of 1812, World War I, and World War II, and infamously in World War II to intern people of Japanese descent. And so now all of a sudden the president's saying, well, I'm just going to use it against the gang, and you can't review what I'm doing. If the president gets away with this, then anybody can be designated an enemy alien and shipped off to a Salvadoran prison. And those Salvadoran prisons, as you said in the introduction, supermax prisons, our plaintiffs are in real trouble there.
And on the anybody front, I should say here that even if someone belongs to a terrible gang and has done terrible things, they shouldn't be unreviewably shipped off to one of these prisons. And also, there seems very compelling evidence the plaintiffs in this case had nothing to do with this gang. Like, maybe they got a rose tattoo at a Dallas tattoo parlor, or one of them was a soccer player with a tattoo that they got to, that looks a little like their favorite soccer club in Europe, and now have been snatched and thrown into this prison.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that point, Chris, because we have 2 arguments. One is the law can't be used at all, so wartime authority during peacetime. But even if it could, the individuals must be given due process to show that they're not part of this gang. The Supreme Court has made that crystal clear forever, that when this law is used, the limited times it's been used, you have to have due process to show you're not part of the gang. And our plaintiffs dispute that they're members of the gang. More and more evidence is coming out that the people shipped to El Salvador are not part of a gang. I think we're going to see that over and over. And this is a pattern with the Trump administration. They ship people to Guantanamo and say these are the worst of the worst. Even the government had to eventually concede in court filings in our case that they were not actually high-level criminals, but low-level or no criminal, activity. And so I think we're going to see the same pattern here. But these individuals are now, hopefully they are, going to stay out of trouble, but I think they're in real trouble in El Salvador prisons.
Yeah, we should also say there's reporting today that the own intelligence assessment inside the U.S. government found that the gang in question here is not controlled by the government. That to invoke war crime deportation powers, the president asserted that they control a gang, but U.S. intelligence analysts think that that is not true. I mean, this whole thing just seems like such a stack of absurdities. Legal Alert, who's been litigating this case. Thank you very much.
I want to bring in former federal judge and president of Dickinson College, John Jones. Also with us, former communications director of the Republican National Committee and Republican strategist Doug Heye. Here in studio is MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. Lisa, what's going on with this filing and what are the stakes today?
Well, Chris, let's start with what it is that they have been ordered to give to the judge today. By 12 noon today, Judge James Boasberg, a federal judge in D.C., ordered the Trump administration to do one of 2 things. Either they had to invoke what's called the state secrets doctrine and explain to him why, citing case law and facts, they could not reveal more information about the flights that took off on Saturday during a period of time that he was holding a hearing, and he had ordered them to turn those flights around, why they can't provide those details in the interest of national security and foreign policy, that they are so secretive in essence, that they couldn't even share them with a federal judge who is authorized to receive classified information. Alternatively, they can answer 5 questions that he has about the flights. When did they take off? When did they land? How many people are on those flights? And most importantly, when were those folks turned over to El Salvador in custody, which matters to him in terms of whether they were in compliance with his order. Right now, as you know, it's well after 1 o'clock, and we have not seen that filing. I continue to push refresh on the electronic docket on my phone to make sure that we're in possession of the most up-to-date information.
Judge Dickinson, is there a legitimate reason you can think of that would not have been posted yet?
I can't think of a reason, Chris. This is, to me, astonishing and a little bit breathtaking. I can only think that the government is temporizing at this point, and they're just going to see if they can play this out. Typically, as Lisa knows, when there's a hard deadline that's set by court, and indeed a deadline that has been continued for a couple of days, repeatedly, you're going to want to hit the mark if you're the party that is subject to the deadline. I can think of no other reason, and I hope this isn't the case, but that they're trying, as the Wall Street Journal said, to force a showdown here.
I apologize. I think I made you the founder of the college of which you are president. But Judge Jones, let me ask you this. The attacks on the judge aren't just coming from the presidents. I want to play what the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, said just yesterday on Fox.
I will tell you is this judge has no right to ask those questions. You have one unelected federal judge trying to control foreign policies, trying to control the Alien Enemies Act, which they have no business presiding over. And there are 261 reasons why Americans are safer now. That's because those people are out of this country. The judge had no business, no power to do what he did.
Let's be clear here, Judge. Is this judge exceeding his power?
Not at all. And Pam Bondi knows that's not the case. And this is what this administration does, is they basically say that the end justifies the means. And we don't know, and that's what Judge Boasberg is trying to find out, first of all, what the timing was, who's on the flights, and so forth. But the central question, again, as your panelists know, as Lisa and Doug know, the central question is whether or not this archaic, several-century-old law will allow the government to do what it did without due process. There's the root of it that eventually I think Judge Boasberg's going to have the opportunity to get to, unless the circuit interferes. But right now he's trying to vindicate an injunction that he entered last Saturday, and he's trying to figure out, did they defy that injunction? And again, as your panelists know, unless and until that injunction is dissolved, it's operative, and he has absolutely the right to do it. And as Chief Justice Roberts said the other day, the remedy in this case, he's preserved the status quo. The remedy is to appeal, but it's not to defy the court order, and hence the showdown that appears to be emerging at this point with this complete disregard of the deadline by the government.
I think it was Justice Breyer who said, look, this happens every day. A judge rules and one side is not happy. It is another thing to rip apart a judge, particularly if you have the kind of platform that a president or a member of the administration does. And Judge Esther Salas from New Jersey lost her 20-year-old son to political violence. And she told my colleague, Nicole Wallace, it feels like people are playing Russian roulette with the lives of judges. Listen.
I know the value of human life because I've lost the most important thing in my life. And once that genie is out of the bottle, there's no putting it back. So we have to remember that we may not, sometimes we say things in the heat of advocacy, but I just wish that people would realize that we got to tamp it down a bit, because God forbid someone is killed. There's no turning back for that family. There's no turning back for that judge.
No turning back for her family. And you can hear the emotion, Judge, in her voice. What does this moment feel like for folks on the bench all around the country?
Well, Chris, in addition to the parade of horribles that you stated, what we also have are members of Congress publishing information about family members of these judges, and we have activists also outing family members, children of sitting judges. Now, I wonder how a member of the United States Congress would feel if their family members were identified and vilified in this fashion. And of course, President Trump's family appropriately has Secret Service protection. Judges signed up for a certain amount of risk. We knew that when we took the bench and put the robe on. Family members, not so much. I think this is really scurrilous behavior to implicate family members. And I have said this, repeatedly. I served on the Judicial Security Committee by appointment of the Chief Justice. We're going to get somebody killed. Already, Esther Salas, as you just noted, has lost her precious only child, her son. If we're not careful and we don't dial down this rhetoric, it's going to happen again.
And Doug, I think it's important to note again the facts. This judge is not the radical left lunatic the president claims he is. In fact, it was the president's own former White House attorney, Ty Cobb, who made the point. Take a listen.
I mean, having, creepy Caroline Leavitt, trying to talk about this judge as somehow a leftist Democratic judge when he was originally appointed by George Bush, and when he when he was the judge who ordered the release of 14,000 Hillary Clinton emails. This is a judge who plays it straight down the middle. He's ruled very decisively for Republican-leaning positions and very decisively for Democratic-leaning positions, making it plain that he is not an ideologue. This is somebody who follows the law, and he's done so with great character and great success, rarely reversed.
And I think the question here and the concern, Doug, is when the president of the United States, with his platform, says the opposite, do facts hold any real weight?
Well, they should, but they often don't. And Donald Trump knows that. Obviously, we see this rhetoric from Trump over and over and over again and have for years. But the problem and the rhetoric also predates Donald Trump. I worked, Chris, at the Republican National Committee on that Saturday morning when Gabby Giffords was shot. The two police officers who were shot when Steve Scalise was attacked at that baseball game, I worked very closely with in Congressman Majority Leader Eric Cantor's office. They were part of his protective detail. And we saw just last week a candidate was arrested for trying to arrange shootings on his opponents who for some reason he blames for all sorts of things. These are happening more and more. Donald Trump is certainly an accelerant to this, but it's incumbent on all of us to use smarter rhetoric. And it's one of the reasons that I would tell candidates and members of Congress, Republican or Democrat, think really carefully about doing town halls because of how those kinds of events can get out of hand very quickly, and have a real plan of action if somebody comes there to do more than just screaming and yelling, which isn't helpful to the process to begin with.
And Doug, NBC News confirmed that Elon Musk has been donating to members of Congress who back impeaching judges. He also posted, by the way, that they need 60 senators to impeach a judge and, as he put it, restore the rule of law or rule of the people. It would actually take 67 senators. But, I mean, first of all, you have donations that are being brought about by somebody who has a very powerful role in government. And I just wonder, do Republicans want to get into this about having to impeach judges for doing their jobs?
No, I've talked to a few members of Congress in the past week or so, and they want to talk about jobs. They want to talk about how they're going to grow this economy. We've talked so often over the past several months about the price of eggs. Eggs have fallen every week for the past 4 or 5 weeks. I would want my congressional candidates, my members of Congress, talking about that. But that also starts with the president talking about that. Trump did so well for himself when he went to that fast food restaurant in the campaign. I'd send him to a grocery store right now. Focus on those things that should be your strong suit, where he's underwater in the polls right now anyways.
Corruption, plain and simple. That is how a now former commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission is describing President Trump's decision to fire him and the other Democratic commissioner on this 5-person panel. The move continues President Trump's trend of firing members of independent agencies. And those two commissioners say that they plan to fight their firings in court. One of them is joining us now for his first television interview since he was fired by President Trump on Tuesday. Alvaro Bedoya, thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, Anna, thanks for having me.
I know you believe you were terminated illegally. The rules say there must be bipartisan representation on the FTC, and a firing can only be for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance. So what happened here?
Well, I was after work at my daughter's gymnastics class, and I got an email purporting to fire me because I don't think I've been fired. I think I'm still a commissioner. And like you said, there was no cause. This is a naked power grab by the president that, in my view, is going to open up the door for corruption and corporate pardons.
FTC Chairman Andrew Ferguson argued your firing was justified, or at least allowed, arguing that the president is the head of the executive branch and is vested with all of the executive power in our government. I have no doubts, he writes, about his constitutional authority to remove commissioners, which is necessary to ensure democratic accountability for our government. What's your response to that?
Pretty interesting, because when he was nominated, Solicitor General Ferguson took the exact opposite position. But here's the thing, Anna. We can't make this about laws and precedents. We have to make this about who it helps. And the people it helps are the billionaires over Donald Trump's shoulder at the inauguration. Let's tick through them. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg. I am right now today suing or enforcing court orders against each of those men's companies. Take Amazon. Right now, we are suing Amazon because they're ripping off small business owners. We allege they force them to pay up to 50 cents on every dollar they make on the site. And also, they're making it next to impossible for those small business retailers. And you got to be on Amazon if you're a retailer, because it's a monopolist. They're making it impossible for them to offer lower prices off the site. In a world where the president can fire me or any other law enforcer for any reason at any time, it is easy to see how calls are going to be made to the FTC to drop those lawsuits. And if my colleagues there don't comply, what happened to me is going to happen to them.
So let's dig in more into how this impacts everyday Americans. You wrote in a statement, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or someone who's so disgusted with Washington you can barely watch the news, the FTC has worked for you. Explain that. And what does this upheaval mean for anybody out there?
For paying the bills. Absolutely. Let's go back a year to 2024. We were faced with what would have been the largest grocery store merger in history. Kroger and Albertsons proposed to, in thousands of towns, take the biggest supermarket in town and merge it with the next biggest supermarket in town. We have under oath Kroger executives saying they were jacking up the price of milk and eggs above inflation. We have union leaders under oath saying, hey, I can't negotiate for higher wages if I can't point to the supermarket down the street in order to make my case. And yet, Anna, you would not believe the amount of political pressure we got in the form of letters and statements from elected officials, a lot of whom, including some Democrats, were saying, let this through. But we blocked it because it was going to raise prices and lower wages. My worry, Anna, what happens when the next mega supermarket merger comes to town? I am worried it's not going to matter if it's going to raise the price of eggs even more. It's not going to matter if it's going to cut union jobs. The only thing that's going to matter is if some billionaire donor has the president's ear and which way he can tug it. And that's just one case. We're suing John Deere for ripping off farmers and ranchers, making them fix their tractors at dealerships instead of by themselves. We're suing to end those crazy subscription traps where you can only unsubscribe on the phone, even if you signed up online. We are also suing the nation's largest landlord who was ripping off tenants by packing their rent checks with hidden fees. Any one of these cases, Anna, can be withdrawn by a simple vote of my colleagues on the commission. And it's hard to see in a world where hundreds of millions of dollars are flowing to the president's pockets, in a world where he thinks he can fire us at any time, something we contest in court. It's hard to see how this will not result in corporate pardons for all of those companies.
So let me just get clarity here. You just take through a whole bunch of investigations that you're working on, and my understanding is, lawsuits. You and the other Democratic FTC commissioner who was fired, Rebecca Kelly-Slaughter, you were the only judges on a case in which the FTC is alleging pharmaceutical managers have been raising the price of insulin. So what happens to some of these ongoing investigations and lawsuits? You think they're just going to all go away?
We have no idea what's going to happen because this has never happened. In the 111 years of the FTC's history, a president has never tried to remove two commissioners without cause. The last time a president did it was FDR. And you know what the Supreme Court said? Can't do it. You cannot fire an FTC commissioner from an independent agency for no reason whatsoever.
I want to talk more about that on the other side of a quick break. Commissioner, please.
This morning, President Trump's immigration crackdown could be moving into uncharted territory involving the U.S. military. 3 defense officials tell NBC News the administration is considering options to create a buffer zone along the New Mexico border that could include American troops temporarily holding migrants who cross into the U.S. The plan has not been approved, but comes as the White House continues to test the limits of executive power.
Americans can absolutely expect to see the continuation of the mass deportation campaign.
A clash with the federal court system has been intensifying. NBC News has tracked 37 rulings from federal judges that have at least temporarily blocked actions taken by President Trump. And the White House is pushing back.
This judge had no right to do that. They're meddling in foreign affairs. They're meddling in our government.
The Trump administration railing against Judge James Boasberg, who temporarily blocked the president from using an obscure 18th century law to deport alleged Venezuelan gang members to a prison in El Salvador. Boasberg was first appointed to D.C. Superior Court by President George W. Bush, then later elevated to the federal bench by President Barack Obama. In law school, he was roommates with conservative Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Throughout history, federal judges have been seen as apolitical when interpreting the law. The U.S. Constitution established 3 co-equal branches of government: the legislative, executive, and judicial. The system designed to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful through a system of checks and balances. But the White House is arguing voters chose Trump, not the judges.
A single district court judge out of 700 cannot set policy for the entire nation, let alone on national security and public safety issues.
Well,
okay, NBC's Gabe Gutierrez with that report.
Yeah, but hold a second. So let's just, again, explain this.
Judge Boasberg was called a Democratic activist.
A leftist. He was roommates with Brett Kavanaugh, is that right?
He was first appointed, I believe, by President Bush.
Yeah.
And then moved up by
what a radical.
Obama.
You know, the thing is, though, again, this happens time and time again. Maura, we've been talking about this, but they keep saying it, so we need to keep correcting people there and reminding people this happens all the time. And by the way, let me just say, I think that courts, federal courts, and if it gets to the Supreme Court, they're going to give a lot of deference to the president on immigration. They always do, especially on enforcement. But single federal court judges repeatedly step in and stop a president's actions. And on national security, they did it with George W. Bush in 2007 with an NSA warrantless wiretapping, right? So they stepped in in the middle of the war on terror, a hot war on terror. They stepped in. One judge did. One judge stepped in with Barack Obama on DAPA. Again, about immigration. One federal judge did. One federal judge stepped in the Biden administration on vaccine mandates. But this happens all the time. It happens to every president. So for the Attorney General of the United States and other people saying, why, one judge can't. No, one judge can do this. One judge has done this, and they can't defy a federal judge that's done it. That's how Madisonian democracy works. And as Republicans are saying in the Senate, if you don't like it, that's why God made appellate courts.
Well, that's also why we have the separation of powers. Anybody could go watch the Schoolhouse Rock series, and I recommend that to learn that actually the president in a democracy cannot just do anything he wants against the orders of courts. We do have 3 branches of government still in this country, and I think
separate,
equal. Thank you.
Yeah,
but the key here is the attack on this judge, and we're seeing this. It's the same through line with the attacks on Liz Cheney. This is really not about an ideological issue. This is about Donald Trump and this White House attacking anybody who stands in their way. And that is an authoritarian impulse. This is, across the board. It doesn't matter. It's clear right now what the ideology of the person is. If they are willing to have the courage to speak out against this administration in any way, whether they be a university president, a Republican-appointed judge, if they are doing their job, and if they are upholding the office that they took an oath for, and that happens to conflict with what the White House wants, this White House will go after them.
Well, the thing is, though, the argument right here is not really even on the law.
Right.
He just wants to get the facts. Okay, so who did you deport? You say they're in a gang. Give me some of the details. Give me the facts. When did the flights take off? So this judge is just trying to do what any judge throughout history would do, get the facts so he knows how to apply the law to the facts. And so, again, it is three separate but equal branches. And the fact that they keep pushing back hard, we talked about this off air. I think Donald Trump kind of tipped his hand when he talked about Bobby Knight a couple days ago. They're just working the refs, like Bobby Knight worked the refs. And so they're pushing. And then when they're asked, are you going to defy court order? And they go, well, of course not. We're not going to defy the court order. The judges in the courtroom are, of course, Your Honor, we're going to get you the information. We're not going to defy. But then at the same time, they're doing the Bobby Knight thing. We're constantly working the refs. And I will say, with consequences, a New York Times story talking about yesterday, the danger that federal judges are in. And let me tell you, I had people close to me who were friends with a federal judge in Birmingham, Alabama. I think in the 1980s, that got blown up and killed in an assassination. So, you totally get people, fighting on the issues, debating hard on the issues. But you just can't call these judges lawless or anything else because they're doing what judges did to Joe Biden, what judges did to Barack Obama, what judges did to George W. Bush.
Yeah. And we have seen so many of Trump's top allies, Stephen Miller, Elon Musk, suggesting these judges who are now under threat, they should be impeached. They should be removed, forgetting the ideas of the co-equal branches of government. Although I should note that Schoolhouse Rock that taught us all that now in jeopardy because the Department of Education is going to be closed. So therefore, that won't be as widespread as previously. But I think there is an element here, though I've been talking to people in the West Wing, and I have a piece today about how they're doing this on the immigration front, about Stephen Miller at the forefront of this, trying to use presidential powers, arcane ones. We saw one already that dates from the 1798 to try to push the limits as to what they can do. And that includes now trying to intimidate federal judges to move the law, if need be, as we heard from President Trump in the interview this week, saying, no, we're not going to defy a court order, but clearly setting a template, Peter Baker, to eventually do so. And some argue perhaps already have. So that's my question to you, is the strategy here from the West Wing to keep testing, to keep pushing, to keep prodding, to looking for the weak links, that, maybe right now they will largely obey court orders, maybe try to fight them on technical grounds, but it certainly seems like they're laying the groundwork for something bigger.
Yeah, they're explaining to their public their version of what's happening, right? So the president says, I'm going to obey court orders. At the same time, he's now stirring the pot on this impeachment stuff. So what happens yesterday morning? He sends out a fundraising email titled Impeach, 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 specifically going after Jeb Boasberg, the judge, in the case we're talking about here, to his supporters, who describing the judge as a radical lunatic, all that kind of stuff. So he's explaining to his public, at the very least, why he's losing. So the story to his public, to his base, to his supporters, isn't that Donald Trump is violating the law, as according to these federal judges. The story is the federal judges are off their duties. They're not the rogue judges. They're somehow not doing it. That's why Chief Justice Roberts, I think, spoke up, because he wanted to make it not about one judge, not about Judge Boasberg, but about the system. And in taking those arrows himself a little bit, he's saying, you're not being fair to, you're not right to go after one judge, basically. This is about the judiciary and how we work. And you can appeal if you don't like the judgment. But you're right. The question is whether they're laying the groundwork for something more radical down the road. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the concern by a lot of people in Washington right now, including Republicans.
And Rev, as the Wall Street Journal editorial page said yesterday, you don't want your decisions challenged. Follow the law. And by the way, Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Journal editorial page saying, you don't like the results, follow the law.
I think that the fact that it was Murdoch's Wall Street Journal saying that shows how far out this is. And you've got to wonder what they're building toward. But when you look at the fact that Donald Trump said from his first term, his hero was Andrew Jackson, who defied the law. I learned from our historian here that he wasn't the one that said enforce it, but he certainly was the one that would challenge it. Mm-hmm. Trump gave every signal that he intends to upset how we deal with the balances of power and enforcement of laws of judges. And I think that this is what we're seeing, a test run only God knows where this is really leading in terms of where they want to go with this.
Well, I mean, they're going to push the boundaries as far as they can push the boundaries. They've said it. And they are certainly well within their rights to try to push the boundaries as far as they can. But when a judge and when courts push back and say, nope, can't cross that line, that is the law of the land.